Hi, my name is Jason Smart. I'm a special correspondent for the Kiev Post, and I also happen to be a political scientist that studies Russia, namely Russia in the Putin era. And there's a lot of people these days talking about the Chinese Russian relationship. What's really going on there? Is it true that the Chinese and Russians will unite together and fight against the West? Or is this the reason, because of that threat, that we should be working with the Russians? We should, in fact, be partnering with the Russians to prevent them from getting together with the Chinese and ganging up against us. Is that realistic? Well, there's a lot of people who argue quite the opposite. The Chinese have made a very calculated interest that they're going to betray the Russians. There is no partnership. They are not going to work together for the long term. In fact, let's say that China's already made up its mind. It's going to put a knife into Putin's plans, and it's not going to participate further in this no limits partnership, which the Chinese and Russians announced immediately before the full scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. So, what's the truth behind it? What's actually going to happen in the Chinese Russian relationship, and how much of a threat does it pose to us in the West? So, to determine this, let's look specifically at the trade, the pipelines, the global strategy, the geography, and the power dynamics, and follow all the facts to figure out what is Xi really doing? What is his plan? He's always got that huge smile that he flashes when he's with Putin. But is that hiding, in fact, some sort of betrayal that's ahead? Well, first, let's look at the money, because that's where we could see if someone actually puts up or shuts up. It's very easy to announce that there is a eternal partnership, but it's very different who you cut checks to. So in 2024, trade between China and Russia did in fact hit a record. It's about $245 billion. That is quite a bit. Keep in mind, though, that's about the same as the GDP of, say, Kansas or Iowa in the United States. So it is significant. But in contrast, trade with the United States was about $450 billion. Trade with the European Union was about $550 billion. Considering other Asian partners of the United States and Europe, such as South Korea, such as Japan, we see that, in fact, China is very, very, very integrated as an economy with the partners of the United States and the United States itself. So while it might be nice to have Russia around as a partner, it's not necessary for China. On the other hand, it's very necessary to have the West. Without the West, the Chinese economy has significant problems. And that's why we see the panic, full panic, that started after Donald Trump announced the 145% tariff on Chinese goods. China, of course, announced that it was going to have reciprocal tariffs, but the fact is they were clearly spooked. They understood very well that these sorts of tariffs would be a disaster for the Chinese economy. And so the Chinese immediately requested talks, which are occurring now, which seems that they will put a moratorium on the initially proposed 145% tariffs. And China is doing its absolute most today, literally, to unlock the exports, avoid new restrictions, and stabilize the foreign investment. Now, keep in mind, they have to do this while they're juggling a slowing economy. Things aren't great right now in China. Youth unemployment a couple of years ago was about 20%. It's dropped down to about 16 or 17%, but the Chinese economy is not doing great. So if China was so spooked about this 145% tariffs, do you think that the Chinese, now having survived that major threat, would want to volunteer for 500% tariffs from the United States? That would seem quite irrational. More than 3 times more, 3 times worse. Well, Senator Lindsey Graham, a U.S. senator, has proposed new sanctions targeting any country that buys Russian oil, gas, or uranium. So this legislation includes a 500% tariff on imports from countries that continue purchasing Russian oil and gas. That's pretty significant. And sure enough, guess who's the biggest purchaser of Russian oil? It's the Chinese. They make up about half. The Indians make up about 35%. If these secondary sanctions were to take effect, China would really face a serious dilemma. So if we continue to support Putin or we continue to buy his oil, though it might be nice to have cheap oil, does this put at risk us having access to the Western markets and the Western financial systems? It's probably not worth it then. We definitely lose more than we gain. And based upon China's history, it would seem that the answer is obvious. Beijing will always protect its own interest. Always. And this would not be the first time that we see China put China first in its partnership with Russia. Aside from refusing to directly participate in the war in Ukraine, obviously, unlike, for instance, the Iranians who are sending Shahed drones, unlike the North Koreans who are sending soldiers, the Chinese have been more cautious. They've definitely violated sanctions, but they've been much more cautious. China has refused to tie themselves to Russia in the war, but also in a much more important thing, in the long term in the energy sector, which is why I think that this proves why they're unlikely to violate U.S. sanctions. Should Lindsey Graham's bill pass, why they'd be unwilling to violate those sanctions is we've already seen historically China walk away from cheap Russian energy resources. So look at the example of Power of Siberia 2. It's a pipeline that is truly the crown jewel of Russia's energy strategy. So this massive pipeline is supposed to link Siberia to northern China. But it's been years, since 2019, that China has said, sure, we're interested, but yet they've not agreed to fund it. They've not agreed to sign the final agreement. They've not agreed to construct it. And why is that? Well, at the end of the day, it's simply not essential for China's future. And at this stage, after years, it's simply not aligned with China's interests at all. Why would they want to tie their own energy future to a country that's so heavily sanctioned and its economy is at risk and it's politically unstable? China's smarter than that. So if this alliance were real, though, and the Chinese really did want to help the Russians, or really did plan on being, for years to come, tied directly to Russia and having years of partnership to come, they would have already built this pipeline. It had been done years ago. The reason they haven't done that is they're not counting on Russia as a long-term partner. Sure, they'll take cheap oil when they can get it, but are they willing to throw away their entire future and their entire economy for that? No. Further than that, they're not willing to go. And you want to look at another example where the Chinese are going around the back of the Russians, quite literally, is look a little bit further west. So look at northwest China, and you get over to Central Asia. So I spent 4 years living in Central Asia, specifically in Kyrgyzstan. I did some work in Kazakhstan. And the region is fascinating, but it's the historic home, as you're aware, of the Silk Road, which is the ancient trading network that connected China to Europe. And it was a land route which traversed by tons of historic figures, including Marco Polo, St. Matthew. And it was famous for moving things such as silk, spices, and gold across Asia to Turkey to Europe. Today, China is trying to rebuild that exact same route. So it's using the Belt and Road Initiative. But here's what's sort of interesting about that. Currently, there are means of transporting things easily from China to Europe. They have the Trans-Siberian Railroad, for instance, but they're not choosing to use that. They're not choosing to go through Russia. They are specifically investing in infrastructure in Kazakhstan, in Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and on the Caspian Sea to get to Turkey. The new rail corridors are being developed, and they completely bypass Russian territory. It's amazing. They are intentionally doing everything they can to avoid Russian territory. They're dealing with multiple other countries, which is harder to negotiate with multiple countries than with one country, in order to avoid being in Russia. Beijing understands that Moscow is strategically unstable, heavily sanctioned, and unpredictable. And it doesn't want its global trade arteries running through a geopolitical minefield. And this is what it looks like when you want to do strategic hedging your bets. This is what it looks like. So what's the difference between them? What's going on there? So there's a really great historian who's worth checking out, Sarah Payne of the U.S. Naval War College. So she says that the world is shaped by a clash between two types of great powers, continental powers and maritime powers. So the continental powers, like Russia, focus on land, territory, buffer zones, and that sort of thing. The maritime powers, like China, focus on trade, ports, global markets. And their goals are completely different. One's interested in ports and expanding, the other one's interested in buffer zones, borders, and territory. But their goals could not be more different. Payne puts it this way. She says that where continental powers see territory to take, the maritime powers see money to make. So it's very easy to remember. So it's true. China is always seeking to expand, how to make money, and the Russians are more obsessed with how to put a new Russian flag on a piece of territory that they can claim as their own. Russia fights wars for control, whereas China is building ports for influence. Totally different strategies. Russia wants borders, China wants markets. I mean, it's why their interests are only aligned on the very surface. In the long-term strategy and vision that they have for the world, they're completely unaligned. Underneath, they're playing completely different games. They are not in the same boat. So look at the example of Ukraine. Russia invades Ukraine, burns through incredible amounts of fortune, lives. It's in a terrible situation internationally and international relations. China's been much more strategic. It has its Belt and Road Initiative. It goes around, helps countries build different means of infrastructure, gets paid for this. It's becoming wealthier, and it's also developed massive influence globally. Russia's influence has gone down globally. In the case of China, it just goes up and up and up, namely in the global south. We've seen just huge success there. And there's another reason that I think that China realizes that it doesn't want to be tied to Russia, this, especially now, be tied to Russia. Obviously, China has its own economic problems, as I mentioned, but Russia's economic situation is terrible. They claim that they have an inflation rate of about 10%. It's certainly higher than that because the key interest rate at the central bank is 21%. It's some of the highest in the world. And the reason that it's like that is because they're burning through money through the defense sector. About half the national budget, about $130 billion, is spent specifically on the defense sector. The problem with that is that it creates a sugar high. So your overall economy is most likely in a recession, but due to the defense industry, it appears to keep going. It appears that it's not in such a bad situation, but it is, in fact, in a very bad situation. The problem is when you're buying things or building things such as tanks that go off to a foreign country, you spend $1 million building that tank, it goes off and it gets blown up. It's gone. That money just stops circulating. You can't resell it. You can't bring back the scrap metal. When you're sending off soldiers to go die and you're giving cash benefits to their family, they blow that money. Well, it creates more inflation. It doesn't really help. Everything they're doing creates more inflation. Russia's in a bad situation. Even the Indians had a dispute with the Russians over taking rubles for oil. Because the Indians said, we're not going to debase our national economy. You can accept rupees. There's no one that's really anxious to have a ton of rubles. And just look at the other problems they have. They're their sovereign wealth fund. Russia had a sovereign wealth fund of about 117 billion. They've whittled that down to less than 30 billion at this point. And so Putin's not buying strength. He's not like the Chinese investing in a long-term strategy. He's burning through reserves and burning through money to execute this war. And China knows this. It's not a partnership of equals when they meet. They understand very clearly that the Russians are desperate, and so they are making clear calculations. And I think that if you just physically look at the interactions between Putin and Xi on the May 9th Victory Day parade in Moscow, it's very clear that Putin was the inferior partner. You see that he was looking up to Xi in every way possible. So even in the global south, let's look at there. Let's look outside of the realm of where they're located. In the global south, we see that they're often competitors. So Russia remains, for instance, India's top arms supplier, and accounts for about 36% of India's arms imports. Whereas China has invested $65 billion in Pakistan through the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, a flagship project of the Belt and Road Initiative. So think about this. The Russians, quick cash gain. They sell some weapons, they get some cash. The Chinese are more strategic. Long-term investment in those economies. And they're going to be there for years to come. Same sort of investment they're not doing in Russia with the Belt and Road Initiative or with the pipeline. Interesting. Why Pakistan? But why not in Russia? Clearly, Russia is not the long-term partner. So let's go back to where we started. Will Xi betray Putin? It seems very clear. He already is. He didn't build the pipeline. He's not going to build the trade routes through Central Asia to bypass Russia just because he's doing it to avoid Russia. He's still negotiating trade deals with the United States. He's definitely got his eyes on the West. He's looking at what Brussels does. He looks at what Washington does. He's not watching what Moscow does. And it's not going to be a betrayal, I think, ever of the dramatic sense. It's going to be something that was totally unexpected, like the Germans invading the Soviet Union in World War II. But it'll be cool, calm, and collected. Xi gives Putin warm words, but it continues to go around his back. And ultimately, it's because Xi is doing what one would expect, serving his country's national interest. China's future lies in the maritime world, not Russia's continental one. Professor Payne has another quote that's really great. She says that maritime powers envision shared spaces, trade, and rules. Continental powers envision control, conquest, and spheres of influence. And that's ultimately why this no-limits partnership between China and Russia has very clear limits. It always has and always will. Putin is alone in the world, and he's skating on very, very thin ice, something that I think he himself already knows. So that's it. What do you think? Is China hedging or outmaneuvering Russia altogether? Let me know down in the comments, and please do give a like and a subscribe. Thank you.